4 mud-spattered pickup trucks thundered across the ancient wooden bridge leading to Shadow Creek Ranch, their engines shattering the sacred morning silence of Arizona's Painted Valley. A plume of crimson dust billowed behind them, briefly veiling the weathered adobe homestead that stood defiant at the end of the winding path. On the covered porch, Nora Redpath paused as she set down her mug of sage tea, her midnight black hair streaked with a single ribbon of silver that caught the first light of dawn. She watched the approaching vehicles with the quiet, measured gaze of someone who had stared down death many times before and found it wanting. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At her bare feet, Shadow, her obsidian-furred wolf-dog hybrid, rose silently, muscles rippling beneath. His gleaming coat as a low growl formed in his throat. Nora placed a weathered copper hand on his head, a small gesture that silenced the animal but did nothing to ease the tension radiating between them. The intricately carved bone handle of the knife, concealed at the small of her back, suddenly felt like a burning ember against her skin, a familiar weight she hadn't truly acknowledged in nearly a decade. The trucks skidded to a halt in a semicircle. Around her front yard, dust swirling around their lifted chassis and oversized tires. Nora's eyes narrowed slightly as she counted 8 men emerging from the vehicles, their movements betraying a dangerous confidence born of numbers and firearms. The tallest among them, a broad-shouldered man in an expensive leather jacket that seemed bizarrely out of place against the rugged desert backdrop, approached the 3 wooden steps leading to her porch. His smile revealed perfectly whitened teeth that gleamed with artificial brightness in the morning sun. "Mrs. Redpath," he called out, his voice carrying a forced warmth that never reached his eyes. "Beautiful morning for a visit, isn't it? I'm Victor Blackwell, CEO of Sunfire Resources. I believe my representatives have reached out several times over the past month." Nora remained seated, one hand still resting on Shadow's head, while the other cradled her earthenware mug. The steam rising from the aromatic tea momentarily veiled her face as she inhaled deeply, centering herself before responding. "They have," she answered simply, her voice quiet, but carrying an unmistakable strength that made the men behind Blackwell shift their weight unconsciously. The resource company had sent 4 letters offering to buy her ranch, each with an increasingly aggressive deadline and thinly veiled threats disguised as market realities. She had burned each one in her sacred fire pit, watching the ashes disappear into the night sky like prayers to ancestors who had defended this land long before her time. Blackwell ascended the first step before stopping abruptly when Shadow's ears flattened against his skull, the animal's yellow eyes fixing on him with predatory focus. 2 of his companions, men with the hard eyes and vigilant posture of hired muscle, moved their hands subtly toward the weapons concealed beneath their jackets. The remaining 5 spread out around the property with practiced efficiency, their gazes sweeping across the small adobe homestead, the ancient barn, and the sprawling desert landscape that stretched toward the distant mesas. "I understand you've been through a difficult time," Blackwell continued, undeterred by her coolness. "Running a ranch this size alone after your husband's passing must be challenging. Our offer would provide you with financial security and the freedom to start fresh somewhere more hospitable." Nora's obsidian eyes moved methodically from Blackwell to the men surrounding her property, noting their positions, their stances, the subtle bulges beneath their jackets that betrayed concealed weapons. With practiced ease that came from a lifetime of observation, she identified the 3 most dangerous among them, not the obvious muscle, but the quieter ones who watched with calculated patience rather than intimidating postures. Old instincts, long dormant but never forgotten, began to stir within her like ancient spirits awakening from slumber. "My land isn't for sale," she said, her voice carrying the quiet certainty of flowing water wearing down stone. Not now. Not ever. Blackwell's smile remained fixed, but something hardened in his pale blue eyes, a flash of anger quickly masked behind practiced charm. Mrs. Redpath, Nora, the desert is changing. The Federal Land Bureau has already approved resource exploration throughout the valley. Your neighbors, the Hendersons and Old Man Sosi, they've already signed agreements with us. You're going to be surrounded by operations eventually. Nora sipped her tea, her expression unchanged as the morning light illuminated the intricate silver and turquoise necklace resting against her copper skin. Then I will become accustomed to the noise, she replied, her gaze steady and unyielding as the ancient mesas that had witnessed centuries of invaders come and go. A younger man, in an expensive suit, stepped forward from beside one of the trucks, a tablet in his manicured hands. Mrs. Redpath, our preliminary offer is $2.7 million, significantly above market value for desert property this remote. But Mr. Blackwell has authorized me to go as high as $3.2 million given your attachment to the land. 3 years had passed since James's funeral. 3 years since Nora had stood beside the handmade pine casket of her husband, the gentle rancher and water conservation specialist whose laughter once echoed across the valley like summer thunder. The ranch felt emptier now. The organic vegetable gardens and indigenous medicinal plants less vibrant, though she tended them with the same dedication James had taught her during their 18 years of marriage. The locals in the small town of Copper Springs respected the solitary widow who supplied healing herbs and organic produce at the farmer's market each month. Her table was always meticulously arranged, her transactions conducted with minimal words and the ghost of a smile that never quite reached her eyes. They spoke in hushed tones about how tragedy had transformed the once warm-hearted woman into a shadow of herself, how grief had carved new lines into her face and added the silver streak to her raven hair despite her being only 42. What they didn't know, what no one in Copper Springs could possibly imagine, was that Nora Redpath had existed long before she'd taken James's name. Before she was the conservationist's wife who grew drought-resistant crops and made healing salves from ancient recipes, she had been Nora Two Rivers, one of the last recipients of the sacred knife-fighting techniques passed down through her mother's Apache bloodline. For 17 summers, from the age of 7 until she left the reservation at 24, she had trained with her grandfather, White Knife, and later with 3 tribal elders who recognized in her the rare combination of physical talent and spiritual connection necessary to master their ancestral combat arts. These techniques, a lethal blend of Apache knife-fighting, survival skills, and spiritual practices, had been preserved in secret for generations, taught only to those deemed worthy of carrying the knowledge. Nora had never sought violence, had never glorified the deadly efficiency of the skills passed down to her. For her, the knife was merely an extension of will, a tool for survival and protection in a world that had seldom shown kindness to her people. The training had been about balance, learning not just how to take life when necessary, but how to honor it always. James had known about her skills from the beginning. It had been one of her conditions for their relationship. No secrets about who she was or what she carried within her. He had listened without judgment as she demonstrated her abilities, had asked thoughtful questions about the spiritual aspects of her training, and in the end had simply said, "That was Nora Two Rivers. I'm in love with Nora Redpath, the woman you choose to be each day." She had believed the choice was permanent, that she had left Nora Two Rivers behind forever when they built this quiet life together. Now, as she rose from her chair with fluid grace that betrayed decades of disciplined movement, Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Nora wondered if that had been naive. At her full height, she was unexpectedly imposing for her slender frame, 5'7", with the straight-backed posture of someone who had never allowed themselves to be diminished by the world around them. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying just far enough to reach all 8 men positioned around her property, "I've made my position clear. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have morning chores to attend to." Blackwell's professional veneer slipped, just slightly, a flash of frustrated rage crossing his features before he regained control. "Of course, we respect your decision, for now." He reached into his jacket and produced a business card, placing it deliberately on the rough-hewn porch railing. "But I encourage you to think about the future, Mrs. Redpath. Resource development is coming to Painted Valley whether individual residents welcome it or not. The wise ones are choosing to benefit rather than resist the inevitable." As they turned to leave, one of the men, leaner than the others, with a jagged scar running from his right temple to his jawline, lingered, his gaze sweeping over the homestead with calculating interest that went beyond simple assessment. When his eyes finally settled on Nora, she met his stare directly, unflinching. For the briefest moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face, as though he'd glimpsed something unexpected beneath her composed exterior, something ancient and dangerous that had recognized him as a threat. "Reyes," Blackwell called sharply, and the scarred man rejoined the group. As the trucks pulled away in a cloud of crimson dust, Nora remained on the porch long after the sound of engines had faded into the vast silence of the desert. Shadow pressed against her leg, sensing the shift in her energy as she methodically processed the implications of the confrontation. The carefully constructed piece of her life with James had been breached, and the intrusion carried the unmistakable scent of approaching violence. Later that afternoon, as Nora harvested white sage from her medicinal garden behind the adobe house, the distinctive rumble of an approaching motorcycle drew her attention. Unlike the aggressive intrusion of the morning visitors, this was the familiar sound of an old Indian chief that had traveled the reservation roads for decades. Sheriff Manuel Begay parked beside her weathered pickup and climbed off, removing his department-issue hat as he approached. His lined face, bronzed by 60 summers under the desert sun, carried the solemn dignity of a man who had seen his people endure countless hardships. "Afternoon, Nora," he called, making his way toward her garden. Manuel had been James's friend since childhood and one of the few people who had checked in on her regularly in the years since the funeral. "Manuel," she acknowledged, setting down her harvesting basket. "What brings you all the way out here?" The sheriff wiped dust from his weathered face, a gesture that revealed his concern more than words could. "Heard you had visitors from Sunfire Resources this morning. Thought I'd come check that everything was peaceful." Nora continued gathering sage, her movements deliberate and focused. "News travels quickly." "Small community," Manuel shrugged, his dark eyes scanning the horizon as though searching for lingering threats. "Blackwell's people tend to leave an impression wherever they go." He hesitated, watching her hands as they moved with practiced precision among the herbs. "Mind if we talk for a few minutes?" They settled on the hand-carved wooden bench James had placed beneath the ancient mesquite tree that provided the only natural shade on the property. For a moment, Manuel seemed to gather his thoughts, turning his hat in weathered hands that had known both police work and traditional craft. "I'm going to be straight with you, Nora," he finally said, his voice carrying the weight of unspoken concerns. "This resource company, they're not playing by the usual rules. There have been incidents with other holdouts who refused their initial offers." Nora's expression remained composed, but her eyes sharpened with sudden focus. What kind of incidents? Manuel's jaw tightened beneath his silver-streaked beard. Water pumps mysteriously, failing. Fences cut. Livestock found dead with no obvious cause, always just enough to make life difficult, never enough to prove deliberate sabotage. He looked troubled, the lines around his eyes deepening. The Sosi place. The old man found 2 of his horses dead at the watering hole last month. The next week he signed with Sunfire. The Henderson Ranch had 3 separate accidents with their irrigation system before they sold. A cold calculation began in Nora's mind, an assessment of threats and vulnerabilities that had once been as natural to her as breathing. The patterns were clear. Systematic pressure applied precisely where it would cause the most hardship for desert ranchers: water access and livestock security. "Have you investigated?" she asked, her voice even. Manuel sighed heavily, a sound as dry and ancient as the desert itself. Tried to, but nothing conclusive, no witnesses, no evidence that would stand up in court. And to be honest, department resources are stretched thinner than ever. He looked at her directly, years of friendship, allowing a rare vulnerability to show in his eyes. County Commission approved a budget cut for rural patrols last month. Commissioner Wilson says it's necessary reorganization, but his brother-in-law works for Sunfire's legal team, so... He let the implication hang in the air between them. Nora nodded slowly, pieces falling into place with grim clarity. "I appreciate the warning, Manuel. I'm worried about you out here alone, Nora. These people, they don't see the land the way we do. To them, it's just resources to extract, profit to be made." His concern was genuine, rooted in both friendship and shared cultural understanding of what the land truly meant. "I can take care of myself," she said quietly, the simple statement carrying layers of meaning that Manuel couldn't fully comprehend. The sheriff studied her for a moment, weathered fingers tracing the brim of his hat. "James always said you were the strongest person he'd ever known." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Still, maybe consider accepting some help, at least temporarily." Nora's eyebrow arched slightly in silent question. "My nephew Miguel returned from his 3rd deployment last month," Manuel explained. "Marine Force Recon. Good kid, solid, looking for work while he decides what's next. Having someone else around, even just during daylight hours, might make certain people reconsider their approach." Nora considered the offer, weighing the tactical advantages against her preference for solitude. An additional presence, especially one with military training, would provide valuable security coverage and allow her more flexibility to implement the defensive measures already forming in her mind. "Send him by tomorrow morning," she said, after a moment. "No promises, but we can talk." After Manuel departed, the cloud of dust from his motorcycle gradually settling back to the earth, Nora walked the perimeter of her property with Shadow, gliding silently beside her. Her eyes, now fully awakened to potential threats, saw her home through the strategic lens she had abandoned years ago, not as the peaceful sanctuary she and James had built, but as territory to be defended. The ranch sat on a gentle rise, with the adobe house and main barn positioned for optimal visibility across the surrounding desert. Natural arroyos marked the eastern and western boundaries, dry now but forming significant terrain features that could channel movement. The northern, edge-bordered federal land, vast and unlikely to be developed in the immediate future. The southern approach, where the wooden bridge crossed Shadow Creek Wash, represented the most vulnerable access point, the same route Blackwell's men had taken this morning. As sunset painted the distant mesas in blazing copper and deep purple, shadows, Nora entered the barn and moved to the back corner where stacked hay bales concealed a trapdoor. The small cellar below had been James's idea initially, a cool storage space for their organic produce and medicinal herbs. Nora had modified it slightly over the years, reinforcing the walls and adding a hidden compartment behind a false panel of shelving. From this concealment, she retrieved a wooden case she hadn't opened since moving to Shadow Creek Ranch. The silver clasps gleamed in the dim light as she lifted the lid, revealing the contents nested in formed recesses within. A matched set of 4 throwing knives with obsidian blades and bone handles carved with ancient symbols. 2 combat knives with perfectly balanced steel blades and handles wrapped in braided leather that had been stained dark with decades of use. And finally, the sacred knife, the yuhei, with its curved blade that followed the natural cutting arc of the human hand, passed down through 7 generations of her mother's bloodline. Nora ran her fingers over the weapons, memories flooding back of countless training sessions under the merciless desert sun, of bleeding palms and aching muscles, of her grandfather's voice guiding her through each movement until it became more natural than breathing. She had never glorified violence, had never sought the rush that came from dominance over others. For her, these blades represented something deeper: her heritage, her responsibility, her connection to ancestors who had survived against impossible odds. James had understood this spiritual dimension of her training. He had listened without judgment as she explained how each knife movement contained prayers, how the Apache fighting techniques were inseparable from respect for life, how her people had developed these skills not from bloodlust, but from the desperate need to protect what remained of their world after centuries of invasion and betrayal. As she lifted the yuhei from its velvet-lined recess, testing its familiar weight and balance in her hand, Nora whispered words James might have spoken himself. "I don't want this fight." The blade caught the last light of day, streaming through the barn's high window. "But I won't let them take our home." The following morning, Nora rose before dawn, as she had every day since childhood. But today her routine shifted subtly, incorporating elements of her former life that had long remained dormant. After tending to her medicinal herbs and feeding Shadow, she began a series of fluid movements in the open space behind her home, katas that combined Apache fighting techniques with meditative breathing. Her body remembered what her mind had tried to forget, muscles responding with surprising readiness as she flowed through positions designed to maximize speed and leverage against larger opponents. The sun had barely crested the distant mesas when the sound of an approaching vehicle drew her attention. A dusty blue Jeep Wrangler navigated the winding path to her ranch, moving with the careful precision of someone respecting unfamiliar territory. Nora watched from the shade of her porch as a powerfully built young man with close-cropped hair and vigilant eyes emerged from the vehicle. Even in civilian clothes, everything about him, from his posture to his methodical visual sweep of the surroundings, marked him as military. "Mrs. Redpath," he called, remaining respectfully by his vehicle until acknowledged. "I'm Miguel Begay. My uncle said you might have some work available." Shadow emerged from the shadows, ears forward with interest rather than hostility, which told Nora volumes about the young man's character. She observed Miguel's reaction. He neither flinched nor made the mistake of challenging the wolf dog's gaze, instead giving a slight nod of acknowledgement to the animal before returning his attention to her. "Your uncle spoke highly of you," Nora replied, descending the porch steps. "3 tours with Force Recon?" Miguel nodded, his expression neutral but attentive. "Yes, ma'am. Afghanistan and Syria." "Any experience with ranch work?" A hint of a smile crossed his serious face. "Grew up helping my grandfather with his sheep before joining the Corps. I know my way around hard work and tough conditions." Nora spent the morning assessing Miguel's capabilities as they toured the property. He asked intelligent questions, demonstrated solid knowledge of basic maintenance issues, and showed particular interest in her solar water pumping system. Most importantly, she noted his constant situational awareness, The way he positioned himself to maintain clear sightlines, his habit of pausing to listen to distant sounds, the unconscious clockwise scanning pattern that suggested professional security training. "Your uncle mentioned you encountered some unwelcome visitors yesterday," Miguel said, as they inspected fencing along the eastern arroyo. His tone was casual, but his eyes were alert, scanning the horizon as he spoke. "Victor Blackwell and his associates from Sunfire Resources," Nora confirmed, watching Miguel's reaction carefully. "They're interested in acquiring my land for their operations." Miguel nodded thoughtfully. "Uncle Manuel mentioned they've been persistent with other property owners in the area." He hesitated, then added, "We had companies like that in Afghanistan. Resource extraction operations with private security that behaved more like militia. Never ended well for the local communities." Nora stopped walking, turning to face the young veteran directly. "Miguel, I should be clear about something. I've refused their offers, and there's a possibility they might employ intimidation tactics. If you work here, you could find yourself in a complicated situation." To her surprise, Miguel smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his serious face. "Mrs. Redpath, I spent 3 years dealing with complicated situations. If anything, that's where I'm most comfortable." His smile faded, replaced by something harder. "Besides, my grandfather taught me that protecting the land isn't just a responsibility, it's sacred duty." By midday, Nora had made her decision. "The job is yours if you want it. 5 days a week, standard wages plus lunch. We'll start with a 2-week trial period." "When can I start?" Miguel asked. "Right now," Nora replied, handing him a pair of work gloves. "We're reinforcing the water storage system today." As they worked together through the afternoon, Nora found herself impressed by Miguel's attention to detail and quick learning. Around 4 o'clock, as they took a break in the shade of the ancient mesquite tree, the young man hesitated before speaking. "Mrs. Redpath, there's something I should mention." He glanced toward the road, then back to her. "On my way here this morning, I noticed a vehicle parked about 2 miles back, just off the main road, behind that rock formation locals call Eagle's Rest. Dark green Ford Explorer with tinted windows. No reason for anyone to be parked there unless they're watching this road." Nora absorbed this information without visible reaction, though internally her mind clicked into a higher state of alertness. "Did they see you notice them?" Miguel shook his head. "I'm careful about things like that. Made it look like I was checking something on my Jeep while I got a better view using my side mirror. 2 men inside, one with binoculars. Surveillance." Nora said simply, "That would be my assessment, yes." Miguel studied her calm reaction with evident curiosity. "You don't seem surprised." "Expected, not surprising," she corrected. "Blackwell strikes me as thorough, if nothing else." Later that evening, after Miguel had gone, Nora implemented the first phase of her defensive strategy. She moved methodically around her property, installing subtle early warning systems at key approach points, fishing lines stretched between cacti just above ankle height in areas where nighttime intruders might cross, small bells concealed within desert brush, modified pressure plates buried beneath sand at natural choke points that would trigger silent alerts to the receiver she now wore on her belt. As she worked in the growing darkness, Nora felt a strange reconciliation taking place within herself, the peaceful rancher she had become, working in concert with the knife fighter she had once been. The skills remained intact, the awareness sharp, as though these aspects of herself had been patiently waiting beneath the surface of her new life. The following days established a new rhythm at Shadow Creek Ranch. Mornings were devoted to regular ranch work with Miguel's assistance. Afternoons focused on maintenance and preparations for the coming monsoon season. Nights became a time of vigilance and training, as Nora reconnected with the combat disciplines of her heritage. In the privacy of the barn, illuminated only by a single lantern, she created a training area with targets fashioned from hay bales and suspended leather pouches filled with sand. Each evening, she ran through drills that gradually reawakened muscle memory, footwork patterns designed to maximize mobility on uneven terrain, drawing techniques that could bring a blade from concealment to combat readiness in a fraction of a second, throwing sequences that transformed ordinary objects into deadly projectiles. At first, her movements lacked their former fluidity, timing off by crucial microseconds that would matter in a real confrontation. But with each session, the old precision returned, her body remembering what her mind had tried to forget. 5 days passed without incident, then 6. The surveillance continued but maintained its distance, watching, assessing, gathering information. Nora used these days of relative calm to strengthen her position, working with Miguel to implement security enhancements disguised as ordinary ranch improvements. Motion-activated solar lights installed around outbuildings, reinforced locks on all structures, cleared fields of fire around the main house that appeared to be simple landscape maintenance. On the 7th morning, Miguel arrived earlier than usual, his expression grave as he approached the porch, where Nora sat drinking her morning tea. 2 men were watching your south fence line last night, he said without preamble. I spotted them on my way home around sunset and doubled back on foot to confirm. They had night vision equipment and were documenting your routine, military-style operation, timed observations, notation, shift changes, not just casual intimidation. Nora nodded, unsurprised. They're establishing patterns, identifying vulnerabilities. Miguel's eyebrows rose slightly at her calm assessment. That's exactly what I was thinking. It's the same procedure we used before. He stopped himself, then continued more carefully. In my previous work, before any significant operation. Did they spot you? No, I'm still certain of that. Nora sipped her tea, mind working through implications and possibilities. Miguel, I'd like you to take some time off. 3 days, starting tomorrow. He immediately stiffened. With respect, Mrs. Redpath, this isn't the time for me to leave. If they're planning something— They are, she interrupted gently. And your absence will accelerate their timeline, which is precisely what I want. Miguel studied her with sudden intensity, as though truly seeing her for the first time. You're baiting them, he said slowly, making them think you'll be more vulnerable. Nora met his gaze steadily. I have my reasons. At least let me stay nearby. I can camp on the federal land just over the northern ridge. If anything happens— She shook her head firmly. I need you to be seen leaving. I need them to believe I'm alone. She paused, then added, Trust that I know what I'm doing. Miguel fell silent, clearly conflicted between respect for her wishes and his protective instincts. Finally, he nodded once, sharply. 3 days, but I'll need a way to know you're safe. Smoke from my morning fire, visible from the north ridge. At dawn, Nora agreed. No smoke means come immediately, otherwise return as scheduled on Saturday. That afternoon, Nora drove into Copper Springs for the first time in weeks, parking her weathered pickup outside the general store that had served the remote community for generations. Inside, the familiar scent of leather goods, fresh coffee, and sage welcomed her as Rosa Martinez looked up from behind the ancient wooden counter. Nora Redpath, the store owner exclaimed with genuine pleasure. Twice in 1 month must be some kind of record. Nora allowed a small smile in return. Need some supplies, Rosa? Some not on my usual list. Rosa raised an eyebrow but nodded. Whatever you need. If I don't have it, I can order it. Over the next half hour, Nora filled a basket with items that seemed innocuous individually, but would serve specific purposes in her security plan. Heavy-gauge wire, specialized adhesives, battery-powered motion sensors, and several other components. As Rosa tallied her purchases, the older woman leaned across the counter and lowered her voice. Heard Blackwell and his boys paid you a visit last week. You holding up okay out there on your own? "I'm managing," Nora replied, her tone neutral. Rosa studied her for a moment. "You know, my cousin works for the county records office. Says there's something strange about those sunfire permits. Environmental surveys rush through, water rights applications expedited without proper review." She shook her head disapprovingly. "Just saying, you're not the only one with concerns about these people." Nora nodded thoughtfully. Good to know where things stand. Her next stop was the Turquoise Diner, where most of the town's business was, conducted over endless cups of coffee and homemade pies. The lunch crowd was just arriving as Nora slid into a booth near the back, positioning herself with a clear view of both entrances, another habit from her previous life that had never quite disappeared. Lily Whitehorse, the diner's owner and head waitress, approached with a coffee pot and a surprised smile. "Nora, don't usually see you in town on a Wednesday." "Thought I'd treat myself," Nora replied, accepting the coffee. "Is the venison stew still on the menu?" "For you, always." Lily filled Nora's cup, then glanced around before leaning closer. "Heard you turned down Sunfire's offer. Again. Must have made Blackwell's blood boil. Man's not used to hearing no." Nora sipped her coffee. "You hear anything else about them? Or about other properties they've acquired?" The waitress's expression turned serious. "Old man Sosie's land. They've already started drilling test wells. Promised him they'd protect the ancient burial site on the eastern ridge, but had equipment on it within days." She shook her head. "The Henderson place is next, supposedly breaking ground next week for some kind of regional operations center, whatever that means." The conversation paused as Lily went to serve other customers. Nora ate slowly, using the time to process what she was learning. The pattern was becoming clearer. Pressure, promises, payoffs, all orchestrated to transform the valley regardless of cultural or environmental impacts. As Nora was finishing her meal, the diner's door swung open, admitting Victor Blackwell, himself, accompanied by a slender woman in an expensive pantsuit and the scarred man she'd noticed during their first encounter. Reyes. Blackwell scanned the restaurant, his confident smile faltering momentarily when he spotted Nora. After a moment's hesitation, he guided his companions to a table near the front. Lily returned to Nora's table, rolling her eyes. "Speak of the devil," she muttered. "That woman with him is from the State Economic Development Board. Been in town 3 days meeting with the tribal council." Nora nodded, suddenly very still, as she observed Blackwell gesturing animatedly while the state official nodded with practiced interest. Reyes remained standing, positioning himself where he could watch the entire diner. His gaze met Nora's briefly, and she allowed herself a small, knowing smile that caused his eyes to narrow suspiciously. "Lily," Nora said quietly, "I'll take the check. And if you're interested in preserving some of Copper Springs' heritage, you might want to mention those broken promises at the Tosi property to our visitor from the state office." After leaving the diner, Nora made one final stop at the county records office. Using the pretext of checking watershed maps for irrigation planning, she spent an hour examining the Sunfire Resources development plans that had been filed publicly. What she found confirmed her suspicions. The project was far larger than most townspeople realized, encompassing not just ranch lands but sacred sites and ancient aquifers critical to the region's ecological balance. By the time Nora returned to Shadow Creek Ranch, the afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the desert landscape. She parked behind the house, unloaded her purchases, and was heading toward the barn when she noticed fresh tire tracks crossing the edge of her property near the eastern arroyo. Shadow, who had been confined to the house during her absence, now padded silently at her side as Nora followed the tracks to where they disappeared into a cluster of tall sandstone formations. Careful inspection revealed cigarette butts and boot prints in the soft sand, evidence of at least 2 individuals. who had conducted prolonged surveillance of her ranch from this concealed position. The message was clear. They were watching, assessing, preparing. The confrontation at her home had been just the opening move in what was becoming an increasingly dangerous game. Back at the house, Nora called Miguel and confirmed their plan. He would leave visibly tomorrow morning and return in 3 days. Then she spent the evening implementing enhanced security measures using her purchases from town. By midnight, every approach to her property was covered by subtle but effective warning systems that would alert her to unwelcome visitors. In the barn, she spent 2 hours refining her knife skills. The blade of her sacred yuhei caught the lantern light as she moved through combat forms with increasing fluidity. Each sequence focused on exploiting an attacker's vulnerabilities, the points on the human body where precisely targeted pressure could neutralize threats regardless of an opponent's size or strength. As she completed her final training sequence, a distant howl echoed across the desert, a coyote calling to its pack. Nora paused, listening as Shadow answered with a low rumble from outside the barn door. The night sounds of the desert spoke to her as they had when she was a child, learning from her grandfather. Warnings, signals, messages for those who knew. How to interpret them? Tomorrow Miguel would leave, and Blackwell's men would note his absence. The trap they believed they were setting would be sprung, but not in the way they anticipated. They were coming for a solitary widow they assumed was vulnerable and afraid. They would find Nora Two Rivers instead. Dawn arrived with a blood-red sky that painted the distant mesas in crimson and gold. Miguel departed as planned, his blue jeep, raising a cloud of dust visible for miles as it crossed the wooden bridge and disappeared down the winding road toward town. Nora stood on her porch watching until the dust settled, aware that unseen eyes were likely documenting this significant change in her routine. She spent the morning maintaining normal activities, tending her medicinal herbs, checking water levels, feeding her small flock of chickens that provided a sustainable source of eggs. To any observer, she appeared to be following her usual patterns, seemingly unaware or unconcerned about her isolation. In reality, every movement served a dual purpose, allowing her to verify security measures and reinforce the illusion of vulnerability, while staying alert to changes in her surroundings. Shortly after noon, Nora noticed a subtle shift in the desert's energy. The cicadas near the eastern arroyo fell silent simultaneously, an unnatural quiet that suggested disturbance. Shadow's ears pricked forward, his yellow eyes fixed on the same area. Someone was approaching, someone trying to remain undetected. Rather than revealing her awareness, Nora continued harvesting herbs, gradually working her way toward the old storage shed where she'd concealed one of her knife caches. Once inside the weathered structure, she retrieved 2 throwing knives, securing them in specially designed sheaths at the small of her back before returning to her garden. The weight of the blades against her spine felt like reconnecting with an essential part of herself she'd long denied. The afternoon stretched on without incident, the desert heat intensifying until the air shimmered above the sand. Nora completed her outdoor tasks and retreated to the adobe house as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. Through the kitchen window, she observed a dark-colored vehicle briefly visible on the distant road before disappearing behind the rock formations that bordered her property to the south. Preparations, not yet action. Assessment before commitment. As twilight settled over Shadow Creek Ranch, Nora implemented the next phase of her strategy. She moved through the house lighting oil lamps in strategic positions that would create the impression of normal evening activities while carefully avoiding silhouetting herself in any window. Then she prepared the barn, arranging tools and equipment to create obstacles and channeling points that would control movement through the space. Darkness had fully descended when her first early warning system triggered, a silent alert on the receiver at her belt, indicating movement at the property's southern boundary. Nora moved quickly but quietly to intercept, circling to approach from the west rather than from the direction of the house. Two figures dressed in dark clothing advanced across her property with practiced stealth, using night vision equipment to navigate in the darkness. Their movement patterns suggested professional training, maintaining proper spacing, using available cover, communicating with hand signals rather than voices. They approached the barn first, not the house, suggesting they sought to eliminate potential threats to their primary operation. Nora positioned herself behind an ancient juniper tree, 30 yards away, observing their methodical approach. She recognized one immediately from his distinctive silhouette and movement pattern, Reyes, the scarred man from Blackwell's team. The second man was larger, moving with the heavy confidence of someone who relied on physical intimidation. They reached the barn unaware that Nora had positioned herself on their flank. She waited as they paused at the entrance, Reyes keeping watch while his companion began working on the lock. The moment of opportunity arrived as the larger man became fully focused on the door while Reyes scanned the area toward the house, neither man covering their rear. "You're trespassing," Nora called out, her voice calm and clear in the desert night, both men startled, spinning toward the sound. Reyes recovered quickly, adopting a casual posture. "Mrs. Redpath, seems we've gotten turned around looking for access to the federal land. Sorry to disturb you." "With lockpicks and night vision goggles?" Nora asked, stepping forward into the open space between shadows. "That's an unusual hiking kit." The larger man shifted his weight, positioning himself to rush her if necessary. Reyes's hand drifted toward his waistband, where Nora had already noted the outline of a concealed weapon. "You've got quite an imagination, lady," the larger man said with a dismissive chuckle. "We're just passing through." "No," Nora replied, her voice dropping lower. "You're leaving, now, while you still can." Something in her tone, a quiet certainty beyond mere bravado, caused Reyes to hesitate. He studied her more carefully, noting, for the first time, how she had positioned herself, how her stance suggested not fear but readiness. "Come on, Craig," he said to his companion, making a slight gesture with his head. "The lady wants us off her property." The larger man, Craig, looked disappointed but nodded. "Sure thing, no harm done." They began to move away, angling toward the property line rather than back the way they had come. Nora maintained her position, tracking their movements. When they were about 40 yards distant, Reyes stopped and turned back toward her. "This isn't going to end the way you think, Mrs. Redpath," he called, his voice carrying across the quiet desert. "Smart play is to take the money while it's still on the table." "Your concern is noted," Nora replied evenly. "Not concern, just in professional observation," Reyes's voice hardened. "I've seen how these situations play out for stubborn holdouts. Never pretty." "Then you should recognize a professional warning when you hear one," Nora responded, allowing a trace of her former self to surface in her voice. "Next time you step foot on my property uninvited, you won't be walking off it." Craig laughed derisively. "Big talk from a rancher's widow." Reyes, however, had gone very still, something in Nora's demeanor finally registering with his security training. He studied her with narrowed eyes, recognizing the incongruity between the quiet widow and the confident woman who now confronted them without fear. "Let's go," he said to Craig, his tone suddenly serious. "We're done here for tonight." As they disappeared into the darkness, Nora remained motionless, listening until she was certain they had truly departed. Then she moved swiftly to assess what they had been attempting at the barn. The lock showed signs of tampering, and a small electronic device had been attached to the doorframe, likely a remote-triggered incendiary mechanism designed to cause a fire that would spread quickly through the hay storage. Nora carefully removed the device, noting its professional construction. This wasn't simple intimidation. It was calculated destruction, meant to drive her from the property through seemingly accidental means. She worked methodically to secure the barn and place additional warning sensors around its perimeter. By the time she finished, the moon had risen high, casting silver light across the landscape James had loved so deeply. The confrontation marked a turning point. Blackwell's men had moved beyond intimidation to direct action, and Nora had revealed that she was not the helpless widow they had expected. The game had changed, and while they might not yet understand exactly who they were dealing with, they had glimpsed enough to know their assumptions had been dangerously wrong. Inside the house, Nora made a single phone call to a number she hadn't used in years. When the line connected, she spoke just 3 words: Two Rivers requesting assistance. After a brief pause, a deep voice responded. Verification phrase. Nora recited from memory the Apache proverb her grandfather had taught her. The code sequence, permanently etched in her mind despite the years of disuse. The mountain cannot be moved, but the path can be changed. Verification accepted. What do you need, Nora? Information only. Target, Sunfire Resources, principals, operations, security personnel. Timeline? Immediate. Acknowledged. Stand by for secure delivery. Nora set down the phone, a familiar calm settling over her. Phase 2 had begun. Blackwell and his men had determined the rules of engagement through their actions. Now it was time to know exactly who she was dealing with and to ensure they understood exactly who they had challenged. The information arrived before dawn. Nora sat at her kitchen table, a steaming mug of sage tea untouched beside her as she reviewed the documents delivered by a silent courier. A young Apache man who had appeared at her door like a shadow and departed just as quietly after delivering. A weathered leather messenger bag. What she read painted a far more complex picture of Sunfire Resources than public records had revealed. The company was merely the public face of a network of shell corporations leading back to Helios International, a conglomerate with interests ranging from resource extraction to military contracting. Financial records showed massive investments in the Painted Valley region, far more than a simple mining or drilling operation would justify. Water rights acquisitions throughout the watershed revealed a strategic consolidation of natural resources on a scale that implied high-level political connections and long-term planning. Most concerning were the personnel files. Victor Blackwell's background included 7 years with a multinational extraction company whose operations in South America had left a trail of environmental devastation and displaced indigenous communities across 3 countries. His operations had repeatedly violated regulations while avoiding significant penalties through political connections and legal maneuvering. Reyes, full name Marcus Reyes, had a military background that included ranger training followed by 6 years with a private security firm specializing in resource protection in conflict regions. His personnel file noted exceptional aptitude for territorial security and willingness to implement necessary measures when conventional options fail. Corporate euphemisms for a man comfortable with violence when it served his employers' interests. The second man from the previous night, Craig Denton, had a lengthy criminal record, including assault and property destruction charges that had been consistently reduced or dismissed through legal intervention. He had been officially employed by Sunfire for 4 months as a site preparation specialist. Most significant was the final section detailing Helios International's true interest in the region. It wasn't just about water rights or conventional resources. Preliminary geological surveys indicated substantial reserves of uranium and rare earth minerals essential for advanced technology and weapons manufacturing. The land they were purchasing sat atop what could become one of the largest domestic sources of these critical materials, worth billions if properly developed. The final note in the file was the most immediately concerning: satellite imagery, showing a convoy of 3 unmarked SUVs departing from a Helios training facility in Nevada the previous day, heading southeast toward Arizona. Facial recognition had identified 4 additional security operatives with backgrounds in tactical operations, all now on the Helios payroll and likely en route to reinforce Blackwell's local team. Nora closed the file, her mind processing the implications with cold clarity. The stakes had risen dramatically, but so had her understanding of her opponents. This wasn't about land development or even typical corporate greed. This was a strategic resource play with international implications, explaining the high-level political support and willingness to employ extreme measures against holdouts like herself. She moved to the kitchen window, watching the first light of day spreading across her land. The ranch that had represented peace and new beginnings now stood at the center of a conflict far larger than a widow's resistance to change. But understanding the true nature of the threat brought clarity rather than fear. Nora knew how to operate against adversaries with superior resources. It had been fundamental to her grandfather's teachings from the beginning. As the sun crested the distant mesas, Nora began preparing for what she now recognized as inevitable: direct confrontation. The men who had come to her property last night would return, likely with reinforcements. They had tested her defenses, assessed her capability, and would now plan a more decisive approach. She moved through her home with practiced efficiency, redistributing her weapons to strategic locations, throwing knives concealed behind furniture, combat blades positioned near doorways, the sacred oué secured at the small of her back where it could be drawn in a single fluid motion. The desert had taught her people generations ago that when facing a superior force, the environment itself becomes your greatest ally. Nora would transform Shadow Creek Ranch into a battlefield of her choosing, where every shadow, every corner, every approach would be designed to neutralize the advantages of numbers and conventional weapons. Her grandfather's voice seemed to echo in her mind as she worked. Remember, little knife, our ways are not about seeking battle, but ensuring that if battle comes to us, it finds us prepared. The Apache way is not to defeat the enemy through force alone, but to make the very land rise up against them. By mid-morning, Nora had completed her initial preparations. She stood in the center of her property, feeling the desert wind against her face, and made a decision. Rather than waiting for night to conceal their approach, she would force Blackwell's men to confront her in daylight, on her terms, in her territory. Taking a small leather pouch from her pocket, she withdrew a pinch of sacred herbs and cast them to the 4 winds, a ritual her grandfather had taught her before her first combat training, a prayer and a promise. Not a plea for victory, but a commitment to protect what was sacred regardless of the cost. "I see you coming," she whispered to the empty desert, "and I am ready." Midday heat shimmered across Shadow Creek Ranch as Nora completed her final defensive preparations. The desert had fallen into an oppressive silence. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of what was to come. She had transformed her home into a carefully orchestrated battlefield, with each structure serving a specific tactical purpose. The house, with its thick adobe walls and strategic sightlines, would serve as her primary stronghold. The barn offered both concealment and multiple exit points. The root cellar, chicken coop, and tool shed each presented tactical possibilities she could exploit if necessary. The natural terrain, arroyos, rock formations, and the elevated position of the main structures provided advantages she fully intended to leverage. As Nora worked, a large raven landed on the mesquite tree near her herb garden. The bird watched her with unusual intensity, its obsidian eyes tracking her movements. In Apache tradition, ravens were messengers, sometimes harbingers of approaching conflict. Nora acknowledged the bird with a slight nod, accepting whatever omen it might represent. "I see you, grandfather," she whispered. Whether hallucination born of stress or spiritual visitation, the bird's presence strengthened her resolve. Just after 2 o'clock, the distant sound of engines broke the desert. Silence. Nora moved quickly to her observation position, a specially constructed blind on the roof of the house that offered a 360-degree view, while keeping her concealed from approaching vehicles. Through her grandfather's ancient brass binoculars, she watched 3 black SUVs approaching from the south, followed by 2 pickup trucks loaded with equipment. The convoy stopped at the wooden bridge, apparently assessing the crossing before proceeding. The lead vehicle contained Victor Blackwell himself, his expensive sunglasses glinting in the harsh sunlight, as he spoke into a satellite phone. Beside him sat a man Nora didn't recognize, older, with silver hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority. The dossier she had received identified him as Richard Kane, Chief Operations Officer of Helios International and Blackwell's direct superior. The remaining vehicles disgorged a total of 12 men, including Reyes and Craig from the previous night. Their equipment and behavior confirmed her intelligence briefing. These were private security operators with military training, not corporate representatives or ordinary intimidation muscle. They carried themselves with the practiced efficiency of men who had seen combat, their movements coordinated without need for excessive communication. Most concerning was their equipment, tactical gear designed for desert operations, communication, headsets, and what appeared to be non-lethal weapons complemented by concealed conventional firearms. This was a professional extraction team preparing for coordinated action, not a simple intimidation visit. Nora noted their operational pattern as they established a security perimeter and began unloading equipment from the pickup trucks. 4. Men immediately took flanking positions around the property, establishing observation posts with clear fields of fire. 2 technical specialists began setting up what appeared to be signal jamming equipment. The remaining 6, including Reyes, formed the main assault team, receiving final instructions from Blackwell near the lead vehicle. Their intention was clear: isolate the property, neutralize communications, then conduct a coordinated approach that would leave her with no escape options. It was a textbook operation for removing an uncooperative occupant while maintaining plausible deniability for the corporate leadership. What they couldn't know was that Nora had anticipated exactly this approach. Her defensive preparations had been designed specifically to counter such tactics, and the isolation they sought to impose would only serve to eliminate potential witnesses to what would follow. As the team completed their preparations, Nora descended from her observation post and moved to implement the first phase of her counter-strategy. Rather than immediately engaging or revealing her awareness of their presence, she activated the ranch's ancient irrigation system, sending water flowing through channels that would gradually saturate specific areas of the property, creating mud that would slow movement, reflecting surfaces that would compromise night vision equipment, and distinct sounds that would mask her own movements when needed. Next, she released her small flock of chickens from their coop, knowing their erratic movements would trigger any motion sensors the team might deploy. Shadow had already been secured in the root cellar, not for his protection, but to preserve him as an unexpected element she could deploy at a strategic moment. Finally, Nora positioned herself on the front porch, sitting in her rocking chair. With deliberate casualness, a mug of tea in her hands and her throwing knives concealed beneath the serape draped around her shoulders. This unexpected visibility would disrupt their planned approach, forcing them to either delay or adapt their strategy, either option playing to her advantage by creating uncertainty. The effect was immediate. Through peripheral vision, Nora noted increased activity around the vehicles as her appearance threw their operational timeline into disarray. She sipped her tea calmly, appearing oblivious to their presence while monitoring every movement through techniques her grandfather had taught her, watching reflections in the window glass behind her, feeling vibrations through the wooden porch floor, interpreting the subtle changes in bird calls from different directions as human movement disturbed their patterns. After 20 minutes of apparent stalemate, the lead SUV finally approached, dust billowing behind it as it crossed the bridge and proceeded up the winding path to her house. Blackwell emerged from the passenger side, while Caney remained seated, watching through the tinted window. Reyes accompanied Blackwell, his hand resting near his concealed weapon as they approached the porch. "Mrs. Redpath," Blackwell called, his voice carrying the same artificial warmth as during their first meeting, though now tinged with evident tension. "I see you're enjoying this beautiful afternoon." Nora set down her tea on the small table beside her. "Mr. Blackwell, you've brought friends this time." If her awareness of the hidden team surprised him, Blackwell concealed it well. "Representatives from our parent company, Helios International. They're very interested in resolving our situation amicably." "There is no situation to resolve," Nora replied evenly. "As I've stated before, my land is not for sale." Blackwell ascended the first porch step, stopping when Nora's posture subtly shifted. "Mrs. Redpath, Nora, I think you misunderstand. We're not here to negotiate a purchase anymore." "No," she agreed, her voice cooling. "You're here with an extraction team, signal jammers and tactical equipment. Hardly the tools of legitimate business." This time, Blackwell couldn't mask his surprise. His eyes narrowed as he reassessed the widow before him. "You seem remarkably well informed for someone so isolated." "The desert teaches awareness, Mr. Blackwell, something your Helios International colleagues might have learned before attempting operations on Apache ancestral lands." At the mention of the parent company, Reyes's hand moved closer to his weapon, a motion Nora noted without appearing to see. Blackwell recovered quickly, his corporate smile returning with practiced ease. "I think we should speak frankly," he said, abandoning pretense. "The mineral deposits beneath this property are worth billions. Helios International has already secured rights to 90% of the valley. Your resistance is merely delaying the inevitable while diminishing what we can offer you. And yet, here you stand," Nora observed, "with armed men and jammers instead of lawyers and paperwork. That suggests my resistance is more significant than you claim." For the first time, genuine anger flashed across Blackwell's features. "Your property is the access point to the richest uranium deposits in the entire valley. Without it, extraction costs increase by 40%. Every day of delay costs millions in potential revenue and threatens our federal licensing timeline." Nora leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to ensure only Blackwell and Reyes could hear her next words. "Then you should have done better research before threatening a woman whose grandfather was White Knife of the Chiricahua." The effect of the name was electric. Reyes's hand froze near his weapon, his eyes widening in sudden recognition. Among security contractors who operated in indigenous territories, certain names carried legendary status. White Knife was one such name, an Apache elder rumored to have trained special forces in desert warfare and survival techniques during the Vietnam era, whose grandchildren were said to have inherited both his skills and his fierce commitment to ancestral lands. Blackwell, lacking this specialized knowledge, remained unaffected. "I don't know what that's supposed to mean, Mrs. Redpath, but it doesn't change your situation. We've been patient, even generous. That time has passed." He gestured toward the surrounding property, where his hidden teams maintained their positions. "You're alone. Your ranch hand left yesterday. There's no one coming to help you. We're prepared to ensure you leave this property today, one way or another." Nora's expression remained impassive, but her eyes held Blackwell's with an intensity that finally penetrated his corporate armor, causing him to take an unconscious step back. "You've made 3 mistakes, Mr. Blackwell," she said quietly. "First, you assumed that because I live alone, I am alone. Second, you believed that because I appear peaceful, I am defenseless." She rose from her chair with fluid grace that suddenly seemed dangerous rather than domestic. "And third, you threatened sacred land protected by Apache blood for 10 generations. Before Blackwell could respond, a new voice joined the conversation. "Victor, get back to the vehicle. Now." Caney had emerged from the SUV, his authoritative tone cutting through the tension. Reyes had maintained his focus on Nora, his hand still near his weapon but making no move to draw it, his training and instincts clearly at war with his orders. "Sir, we should reconsider the approach here," he said without taking his eyes off Nora. "Explain," Caney demanded, joining them at the foot of the porch steps. "This woman is not what we assumed," Reyes replied carefully. "The name she just mentioned. If she's telling the truth about her lineage, this operation is significantly compromised." Caney studied Nora with cold calculation, his experienced eyes noting details his subordinates had missed. The calluses on her hands inconsistent with simple ranch work, the way she positioned herself on the porch with perfect sightlines, the almost imperceptible bulges beneath her serape that suggested concealed weapons. "Mrs. Redpath," he said, his tone shifting to one of professional respect rather than corporate condescension. "I believe we may have approached this situation inappropriately. Perhaps we should discuss alternatives that could accommodate both our interests." "There's nothing to discuss," Nora replied. "Your men attempted to sabotage my barn last night. You've deployed armed personnel around my property today. You've demonstrated that Helios International operates through intimidation and force rather than legitimate business practices. Those actions have consequences." Caney's expression hardened. "Threats won't serve you well here, Mrs. Redpath. Whatever your background might be, you're still facing overwhelming odds. Not threats, Mr. Kane. Facts." Nora's gaze remained steady. "I've already documented Helios International's environmental violations in 3 states, your illegal water rights acquisitions in this valley, and the falsified impact statements submitted to federal agencies. That information has been secured with multiple distribution triggers that activate automatically if anything happens to me." The corporate executive's practiced composure slipped momentarily as he processed this unexpected complication. "You're bluffing." The widow of a water conservation specialist who spent 20 years documenting corporate abuses. A woman with Apache heritage connected to every environmental protection group in the Southwest? Nora allowed herself a small, cold smile. That would be an unwise assumption. While this exchange occurred, Nora had been tracking movement in her peripheral vision, subtle shifts in position from the hidden team members as they adjusted to the unexpected direction of the confrontation. One operative had moved to higher ground near the eastern arroyo, establishing what would be a sniper position if the situation escalated. 2 others had advanced to positions flanking the house, preparing for potential breach operations. Caney and Blackwell exchanged glances, a silent communication between men accustomed to adjusting strategies when faced with unexpected resistance. After a moment, Caney nodded slightly. "Perhaps we've been approaching this all wrong," he conceded, his tone shifting to conciliatory. "Clearly you're not someone who responds to standard pressure tactics. Why don't we take a step back and explore more creative solutions? Helios could establish a conservation trust for the surface land while accessing the resources beneath. You could remain as property manager with substantial compensation." The offer was designed to create an illusion of compromise while still achieving their primary objective. Nora noted the tactical repositioning continuing around her property, Even as this reasonable alternative was presented, Caney was playing for time, allowing his team to establish optimal positions for whatever came next. "An interesting proposal," Nora replied, deliberately extending the conversation to assess their full deployment. "Though it raises questions about long-term environmental protection, especially for the aquifer that feeds 3 counties. As she spoke, her heightened senses detected a subtle vibration through the porch floorboards. Someone had reached the rear of the house and was attempting to gain entry through the kitchen door. Simultaneously, the operative on the eastern ridge had established his position, the glint of equipment briefly visible against the afternoon sun. Caney launched into a detailed explanation of environmental safeguards Helios could implement, his corporate expertise evident in how convincingly he presented what Nora knew to be empty promises. His performance served its purpose, occupying her attention while his team completed their encirclement of the property. When he finished, Nora allowed a thoughtful silence to stretch between them before responding. "Your proposal deserves consideration. Perhaps we could continue this discussion inside, away from this heat." The invitation, unexpected after her previous hostility, caused both men to hesitate, suspicion warring with the opportunity to gain entry to her home without confrontation. "That would be appreciated," Caney finally responded, sensing potential advantage. Nora turned toward her front door, using the movement to confirm the positions of all team members now surrounding her property. Everything was aligned precisely, as she had anticipated, pieces arranged on the board exactly where she wanted them. As she reached for the door handle, she paused, turning back to the men with an expression of sudden concern. "I just remembered. My irrigation system is running. I should shut it off before we talk, or we'll flood the north field." Without waiting for a response, she stepped off the porch on the side opposite from where Blackwell and Caney stood, moving toward the ancient hand pump that controlled the water flow. This seemingly innocent action accomplished 2 critical objectives. It positioned her away from the immediate control of the men on her porch, and it brought her within reach of the first of her defensive preparations. "This will just take a moment," she called, approaching the pump house, a small structure of weathered wood that appeared to be on the verge of collapse. Reyes tensed, sensing the shift in tactical dynamics. "Sir, we should maintain visual contact." Before he could finish, Nora reached the pump house and pulled the ancient lever that appeared to control the water flow. Instead of shutting off irrigation, the action triggered the first of her prepared countermeasures, a series of controlled releases activated simultaneously across the property. The chicken coop doors burst open, sending 36 panicked birds rushing across the yard. Sprinklers concealed in the herb garden erupted, creating a disorienting spray of water and obscuring visibility. And most significantly, a hidden speaker system activated, broadcasting the recorded sounds of multiple approaching vehicles from the direction of the main road. The effect on the tactical team was immediate. Disciplined professionals suddenly forced to contend with environmental chaos and potential witnesses arriving at the worst possible moment. The operators at the rear of the house broke cover to determine the source of the vehicle sounds, exposing their positions. The flanking team members froze in confusion as chickens scattered across their carefully planned approach routes. In the momentary confusion, Nora disappeared behind the pump house, her movement so fluid it appeared she had simply vanished then dropped into the concealed entrance to the root cellar she had prepared for exactly this purpose. Blackwell's voice rose in frustration. "What the hell is happening? Where did she go?" Caney, with the experience of countless operations, immediately recognized the situation for what it was. "It's a diversion! Lock down the property perimeter. Now!" But his order came too late. Nora had already entered the underground passage that connected the root cellar to the barn. a narrow tunnel her ancestors had dug generations ago to provide emergency escape from Apache raids, now repurposed to give her tactical mobility beneath the very ground her opponents controlled. Inside the dark passage, illuminated only by small LED lights she had installed the previous day, Shadow waited silently, his yellow eyes reflecting the minimal light. Nora paused beside the wolf dog, placing her hand on his massive head. "Now we hunt," she whispered, removing the serape to reveal the full array of weapons secured to her body, throwing knives, the sacred uhe, and a garrote of braided leather, and wire her grandfather had given her upon completion of her training. Above ground, chaos continued to unfold as Blackwell's extraction operation disintegrated into confusion. The corporate executives had expected to intimidate a lonely widow into submission. Instead, they had stumbled into the territory of a predator who had spent a lifetime preparing for precisely this moment. And unlike her opponents, Nora Two Rivers knew every shadow, every passage, every advantage her land could provide. The men above had brought weapons and numbers. She had brought something far more dangerous, the ancient knowledge of how to make the desert itself rise up against her enemies. By the time the tactical team regained their composure and established a proper search pattern, Nora had already taken control of the confrontation. The hunters were about to become the hunted, though they didn't yet realize it. The trap they thought they were setting had become a snare around their own necks, pulled tight by hands they couldn't see. In the barn, Nora released Shadow with a silent hand signal, sending the wolf dog racing toward the house through a concealed route. The animal would draw attention and resources in that direction, while she prepared to systematically dismantle the invasion force that had made the fatal error of threatening her home. As she secured her weapons and prepared for what would come, next, Nora touched the silver and turquoise necklace that had been her mother's, a connection to her lineage, a reminder of why this land mattered beyond its mineral wealth. "I am my grandfather's knife," she whispered, an invocation and a promise, "and today I cut." Dusk descended over Shadow Creek Ranch, the fading light casting long shadows across the desert landscape. Caney's tactical team had regrouped after the initial confusion, establishing a methodical search pattern centered on the house and outbuildings. Their professional training was evident in how quickly they adapted to the unexpected developments. Communication channels remained disciplined, movements coordinated, tactical positions maintained despite the earlier chaos. "I want her found. Within the hour," Caney ordered from his command position near the lead SUV. "She's one woman on foot. She can't have gone far." From her concealed position in the hayloft of the barn, Nora observed their search pattern through narrow gaps in the weathered wooden slats. Their operational approach revealed valuable information. Standard grid search methodology, two-man teams maintaining visual contact, consistent radio check-ins, effective protocols for urban environments or open terrain, but fundamentally flawed. For this landscape, where ancient knowledge trumped modern tactics, the desert had taught her people centuries ago that direct confrontation against superior numbers was suicide. Victory came not through force, but through patience, misdirection, and striking, only when success was assured. Nora would honor these teachings, dismantling Caney's operation with the precision her grandfather had instilled in her through 17 summers of training. Shadow's distant howl echoed across the property, the signal that he had reached his designated position and created the distraction they had practiced. Two members of the tactical team immediately diverted toward the sound, exactly as Nora had anticipated. Their separation from the main group created the first vulnerability in their formation. Moving with fluid silence across the hayloft, Nora reached a concealed exit she had prepared on the barn's western side. A narrow opening that appeared to be nothing more than broken boards from outside. She slipped through the gap and descended to the ground using handholds she had carved into the support beams. landing softly in the deepening shadows. The first team she targeted had taken position near the chicken coop, using it as cover while maintaining sightlines to both the house and barn. Two men positioned back-to-back to eliminate blind spots, their discipline evident in their controlled movements and vigilant postures. One wore the communications gear that linked him to Kaney's command position, the priority target. Nora circled. Behind them, using irrigation channels as concealment, moving only when the wind gusted to mask any sounds. Within 20 yards of their position, she removed a small pouch from her belt and extracted a handful of dried herbs mixed with desert earth, a combination her grandfather had taught her would nullify human scent when approaching from downwind. Applying the mixture to her exposed skin, Nora closed the final distance, using the chickens themselves as cover, their random movements drawing the men's attention in predictable patterns that allowed her to advance undetected. 10 yards. 5. 3. When she struck, it was with the lethal efficiency. Her training had burned into muscle memory. The first throwing knife found its target with surgical precision, not aimed to kill, but to disable, severing the communication equipment at the operator's shoulder before he registered her presence. The second man turned at his partner's startled movement, weapon rising, but Nora had already closed the distance. Her attack was a fluid sequence of precisely targeted strikes, Apache knife fighting techniques designed to neutralize without, killing, targeting pressure points and nerve clusters rather than vital organs. Within seconds, both men lay unconscious, secured with their own restraints, their weapons disabled and communications equipment destroyed. 2 down, 10 remaining. Nora melted back into the gathering darkness before the men's failure to check in could trigger a response from Kaney's command post. Her next targets were already selected, the team that had diverted to investigate Shadow's howl, now isolated from the main group and moving predictably along the eastern arroyo. She intercepted them as they followed Shadow's deliberately laid trail toward the rocky outcropping that marked the property's northeastern boundary. The wolf dog had performed his role perfectly, leading them in a widening spiral away from the central operation, their focus downward on tracking rather than on the threat that now paralleled their movement from higher ground. This time, Nora employed different tactics. Rather than direct confrontation, she utilized the environment, triggering a prepared rock slide that separated the two operators, then using the momentary confusion to approach the isolated man from behind. A precise strike to the base of the skull rendered him unconscious before he could alert his partner. The second man responded with professional efficiency, taking cover and scanning for the threat with his weapon ready. But his position, chosen for tactical advantage against conventional approaches, left him vulnerable to attack from above. Nora descended from the rocks behind him, the sacred uhe gripped in a reverse hold designed for non-lethal strikes. The gill blade's handle connected with precision, and another of Kaney's operatives collapsed without raising an alarm. 4 down, 8 remaining. By now, however, the search pattern had adapted. The failure of 2 teams to maintain regular communication had triggered Kaney's contingency protocols. The remaining operators consolidated into larger groups, sacrificing search efficiency for security. Their floodlights activated, harsh white beams cutting through the desert darkness, sweeping across the property in coordinated patterns designed to eliminate shadows and expose movement. From her new position beneath the porch of the main house, accessed through another of the hidden passages she had prepared, Nora observed Kaney and Blackwell in heated discussion near the command vehicle. Even without hearing their words, their body language conveyed growing tension and disagreement about how to proceed. "This isn't what we agreed to," Sheriff Manuel Begay's voice cut through their argument as his department vehicle pulled up beside. The SUVs, lights flashing but sirens silent. The tribal lawman emerged, hand resting on his holstered weapon as he surveyed the tactical team and floodlights with evident disapproval. "You told the county commission this was a routine property inspection, Blackwell." The unexpected arrival of law enforcement created immediate complications for the operation. Caney stepped forward, interposing himself between the sheriff and Blackwell. "There's been a misunderstanding, Sheriff. We're conducting a security assessment at Mrs. Redpath's request." Manuel's weathered face revealed nothing as he gestured toward the armed men and equipment. "With a tactical team and signal jammers, try again." Nora recognized the opportunity this intervention presented. Manuel's arrival wasn't coincidence. The trusted friend had likely been monitoring the situation from a distance, waiting for the right moment to intervene. His presence created the perfect distraction for her next move. While attention focused on the confrontation near the vehicles, Nora slipped from beneath the porch and circled to the barn, where Reyes had established a secondary command post with 3 operators. Their focus had shifted to the new development at the front of the property, creating a momentary lapse in perimeter security. This time, Nora chose a more direct approach. She triggered the irrigation system she had modified the previous day, flooding the area around the barn with 6 inches of water in a matter of seconds. As the operators reacted to the sudden change in terrain, electrical equipment shorted out in cascading failures. Floodlights, communication gear, and tactical displays all compromised simultaneously. In the resulting confusion, Nora moved through the darkness like a spirit, the techniques her grandfather had perfected, allowing her to navigate by sound and feel rather than sight. One by one, she neutralized the disoriented operators, precise strikes that disabled without permanent injury, each man secured and disarmed before he could alert his teammates. 7 down, 5 remaining. Near the vehicles, the confrontation between Caney, Blackwell, and Sheriff Begay had escalated. Manuel had been joined by 2 deputies, their presence forcing a temporary cessation of the search operation as legal jurisdictions and authorities were heatedly debated. "I've received complaints about unauthorized personnel with weapons on private property," Manuel stated firmly. "Either produce documentation of Mrs. Redpath's permission for this operation, or your people need to stand down immediately." Blackwell attempted to maintain the pretense of legitimate business. "Sheriff, I assure you this is a simple misunderstanding. We've been in negotiations with Mrs. Redpath regarding her property. These security personnel are standard procedure for high-value acquisitions. Then you won't mind if my deputies verify that with Mrs. Redpath herself," Manuel countered, his calm demeanor contrasting with Blackwell's growing agitation. "Where is she, by the way?" The question hung in the air, unanswerable and damning. Caney, recognizing the deteriorating situation, made a decision visible in the subtle hand signal he gave to his remaining operators. Abort and withdraw. Minimize. Exposure, preserve, deniability. Nora observed this strategic retreat from her position near the chicken coop. The remaining operators were consolidating around the vehicles, maintaining professional discipline despite the operation's failure. Caney had shifted to damage control mode, focusing on extracting his personnel and equipment with minimal legal exposure. This transition point represented both opportunity and risk. The tactical teams were at their most vulnerable during withdrawal, attention divided between security and evacuation procedures. But they were also at their most alert, aware that previous teams had vanished without warning or distress signals. Rather than continuing her systematic neutralization of individual operators, Nora chose a different approach for this final phase. The time had come to reveal herself fully, not as a target to be captured, but as a force to be reckoned with. She circled to the front of her property, using shadow and terrain to approach undetected. Shadow rejoined her silently. The wolf dogs presence adding to the formidable image she was about to present. When she emerged from the darkness, it was deliberate and controlled, stepping into the harsh glare of the remaining floodlights 30 yards from where Kane, Blackwell, and Sheriff Begay stood in confrontation. The effect was immediate and profound. The operators nearest her raised weapons instinctively, then hesitated at the sight that greeted them. Nora Two Rivers, standing tall and unafraid, the sacred uhe gleaming in her right hand, throwing knives visible across her torso, and Shadow, a dark sentinel at her side. More disconcerting to the professional security team was the quiet confidence in her posture, not the desperate defiance of a cornered target, but the centered readiness of a predator who had chosen the moment of confrontation. "Lower your weapons," she commanded, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent property. "Your operation is over." Sheriff Begay used the momentary shock to position his deputies strategically, their own weapons drawn but held at low ready. "Mrs. Redpath appears to be alive and well," he observed dryly, "and seemingly not in need of your security assessment after all." Caney recovered first, his experienced gaze taking in both Nora's combat readiness and the strategic situation. 7 of his operators unaccounted for, legal witnesses present, and a containment operation now fully exposed. The calculation was visible in his eyes, weighing options, assessing risks, determining the least damaging exit strategy. "Stand down," he ordered his remaining personnel, his tone leaving no room for debate. "Secure equipment and prepare to depart." Blackwell stepped forward, corporate outrage overriding tactical sense. "What are you doing? We're not leaving without—" "Without what, Mr. Blackwell?" Nora interrupted, advancing several steps. "Without the uranium beneath my land? Without silencing the widow who knows too much about Helios International's environmental violations? Or without eliminating witnesses to tonight's attempted intimidation operation?" Her words, precisely chosen and calmly delivered, landed with devastating effect in front of Sheriff Begay and his deputies. The legal implications hung in the air like the desert heat. Corporate conspiracy, environmental crimes, armed trespass, and attempted coercion, all suddenly documented by law enforcement. "These are serious allegations," Manuel said, his official tone belied by the slight smile touching his eyes as he looked at Nora. "I believe we'll need formal statements from everyone present, and perhaps a federal environmental crimes investigator to review those documentation packages Mrs. Redpath mentioned." Caney, recognizing complete defeat, addressed Nora directly, professional to professional, abandoning the corporate facade. "You've made your point effectively, Mrs. Redpath. What are your terms?" Nora met his gaze steadily, the uhe still held. At ready position, Helios International withdraws completely from Painted Valley. All acquired properties are returned to their original owners at purchase price plus 20% compensation. A conservation trust is established for the watershed, funded by Helios for 50 years of operation, and a formal acknowledgement of Apache ancestral rights to consultation on any future development in the region. "Impossible," Blackwell sputtered. The board will find these terms preferable to federal indictments and class action lawsuits," Nora cut him off. "Especially when the evidence packages I've prepared reach the EPA, tribal authorities, and the special prosecutor for environmental crimes." She turned back to Caney, whose expression confirmed he understood the gravity of their situation. "You have 1 hour to contact your board and secure preliminary agreement. Sheriff Begay will remain to ensure an orderly withdrawal of your personnel and equipment. Your missing operators will be released once the agreement is confirmed." Caney nodded once, sharply, the acknowledgement of a strategist who recognized when a battle was decisively lost. "And the men you've neutralized?" "Unharmed, though their pride may require some recovery time," Nora replied. "They performed professionally. Their mission was simply unachievable. What followed unfolded with surprising efficiency. Corporations built on ruthless acquisition could be equally efficient in strategic retreats when necessary. Within the hour, Caney had secured preliminary agreement to Nora's terms from the Helios board. The reality of potential federal charges and the complete failure of their extraction operation forcing a pragmatic reassessment of priorities. As the remaining vehicles departed, leaving only Sheriff Begay's patrol car in the yard, the first stars appeared in the desert sky. Nora released the captured operators one by one from their secured locations around the property, Sheriff Begay documenting each man's identity and corporate affiliation before allowing them to join the withdrawal convoy. "Going to be a mountain of paperwork on this one," Manuel commented as the final vehicle disappeared across the wooden bridge. "Environmental Crimes Task Force is already on their way from Phoenix. They're particularly interested in those documentation packages you mentioned." Nora nodded. The Uhe now returned to its sheath at her back. "They'll have everything they need by morning." Manuel studied her with newfound respect and curiosity. "You know, when you first moved here with James, I thought you were just a city woman trying to adapt to ranch life." He shook his head slowly. "I've never been so wrong about someone in all my years wearing this badge." "I was that woman for a time," Nora replied, her gaze turning toward the distant mesas now silhouetted against the night sky. "And, in many ways, I still am. James helped me find peace with both sides of myself." "White Knife's granddaughter," Manuel said softly, the name carrying reverence even now. "The old stories about your grandfather are still told in tribal council, though I suspect new stories about his granddaughter will join them after tonight." After the sheriff departed, promising to return in the morning with federal investigators, Nora walked the perimeter of her property with Shadow at her side. She checked each building, reset disturbed security measures, and finally returned to the ancient mesquite tree where the raven had appeared earlier in the day. The bird was gone, but something remained in its place, a single black feather lying atop the bench James had built. Nora picked it up gently, feeling its perfect weight in her palm. "I understand, grandfather," she whispered to the night. "Balance has been restored." Dawn broke over Shadow Creek Ranch as Miguel's blue Jeep appeared on the horizon, returning as instructed after 3 days. Nora sat on her porch, sipping morning tea, Shadow dozing at her feet. The young veteran approached, cautiously, clearly noting the disturbed earth, water damage, and other signs of the previous day's confrontation. "Mrs. Redpath," he called, concern evident in his voice. "Are you all right? What happened here?" Nora set down her tea, a genuine smile softening her features for the first time since he'd known her. "Negotiations, Miguel. Very effective ones." Before he could respond, the sound of approaching vehicles drew their attention. A convoy of official cars appeared on the road, EPA investigators, tribal representatives, and federal prosecutors arriving as promised. The real work was just beginning, documenting Helios International's violations, establishing the Conservation Trust, ensuring the corporation honored the agreement made under duress. "Looks like we have guests," Nora observed, rising from her rocking chair with the fluid grace that Miguel now noticed seemed incongruous with his initial impression of a simple rancher's widow. "Would you mind putting on a pot of coffee? I believe we'll need it." As Miguel moved toward the house, still processing the transformation before him, Nora turned her gaze toward the eastern horizon, where the rising sun illuminated the ancient mesas. The land her ancestors had defended for generations would remain protected, not through corporate agreements or legal documents, but because she had stood as her grandfather had taught her, unyielding as the desert stone, precise as the falcons. dive, patient as the flowing water that eventually carves through mountains. Shadow Creek Ranch had become more than a home. It was now a testament to a legacy that stretched back through 10 generations of Apache guardians. The ruffians who had come to threaten a silent widow had instead awakened a sleeping warrior, with consequences that would echo through corporate boardrooms and tribal councils for years to come. Nora touched the silver and turquoise necklace at her throat, feeling the connection to her mother, her grandfather, and all who had come before. In defending this land, she had finally reconciled the two halves of herself, the peaceful widow and the warrior's heir, not as separate identities, but as complementary aspects of a complete whole. The knife fighter's granddaughter had honored her legacy, and in doing so, she had found a deeper peace than she had ever known before. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.